How a Romance Novel Saved the Galaxy by Ariana de Relte. Chapter 36, Femor 4. Femor eyed the planet of Mandalore as his transport descended with a certain amount of trepidation. He had exchanged a few messages with Arta Kryz since his assignment to look into the author of the Mandalorians' Dilemma. The true Mandalorians were en route to Mandalore at the same time, so they had to be short, but she had suggested they meet so she could share all her data with him. It was apparently too much for it to be transmitted over comms. Femor was suspicious that this was just an excuse to get to meet him in person. However, Kryz was an expert slicer and infiltration expert, so she might very well have more data than your average Mandalorian. He'd have to wait and see, and avoid doing anything interesting or cool in front of any Mandalorians. As it was, he kept his lightsaber and face well hidden under his red-brown cloak, and most Mandalorians didn't give him a second look. He headed for a nearby cantina called the Mythosaur's Bite, easily distinguishable by the two long mythosaur tusks crossed near the tips to make an entranceway. It only occurred to him after he was inside that this was not the usual cantina near a spaceport he was expecting. Everyone had armor on, including the bartender. His very presence without armor was like a neon sign saying he was confident enough to walk into a true Mandalorian bar without being one himself. Sure enough, every single person there turned their head or helmet to stare at him when he entered. He grit his teeth under the cloak and headed towards a grinning Arta Kryz. Outside of a hologram, he could now see she had natural green hair, and her skin had a blue-green tinge, which pointed at non-human ancestry.
A true Mandalorian bar, really?
He asked as he sat down. She pushed a thick, black-looking drink his way. The offer their cantina has Asek ale, she said with a shit-eating grin. He began to realize that Arta Kryz was going to be just as annoying as her brother, but in a completely different way. You may as well take off the hood, Femor. Most of them have already clocked you as a Jedi. He sighed, but did as suggested. She was doing something on her own pad, probably some sort of slicing program. Do you have a second name, by the way? She asked.
No, it's just Femor.
His birth planet didn't use them, and he'd never seen the need to make one up. She pulled the chip out of her pad and slid it across the table.
This doesn't seem like a very secure place to meet,
Femor said pointedly. Everyone in the bar was either blatantly or covertly watching their table.
Jim, she said cheerfully, don't say anything you don't want out on the holonet.
She pointed to the data access chip.
If you have a pad, you can plug it in there. If not, there's a table port.
Femor did have a pad where he had been outlining his research, but he was wary of plugging anything a slicer gave him into his own pad. He put it in the table instead.
That will give you access to the Mandalorian section of the holonet, said Kryz.
Pages and pages of data unfolded in the air, including an entire section that caused him to raise his eyebrow.
Getting it?
Arta shrugged.
Not very original, but that's where the Mandalore has set up their Jedi data and footage.
It wasn't fully relevant to a search for the author of the Mandalorian Dilemma, but Femor was too curious not to click on it. Prominent on the first page was a ranking of popular Jedi pages, with someone called John Antilles at the top. Femor had no idea who that was, but he recognized Master Faye as the second name, and several other masters and knights whose rankings were changing in real time before his eyes. Then a particular page name caught his eye. The Qui-Gon Jinn Hate Squad. He moved to click on it, even as he asked,
"What did Qui-Gon do to piss off the Mandalorians?"
"What didn't he do?" said Kryz dryly.
"You know him? He was my mister,"
answered Femor, distracted by the page itself. Dear Force, Qui-Gon had blatantly mistreated a kid in front of a Mandalorian several times, and not even gone to rescue this Obi-Wan Kenobi when he got sold into slavery by Xanathars of all people. This was the worst diplomatic snafu he'd ever seen Qui-Gon get into, and he'd had to soothe over many a ruffled feather during his time as Qui-Gon's Padawan. Femor could still remember the moment of relief and dismay when he heard that Qui-Gon had repudiated ever having a Padawan. It had caused Femor a lot of anxiety about whether his whole knighthood was going to be thrown into question, but he'd guiltily thought it was probably a good thing for Qui-Gon to not take another student.
Multiple trips to the mind healers had made it clear that nothing was Fimor's fault in their partnership. Qui-Gon just treated everyone the same way. As his Padawan, Fimor had been expected to be as competent as an actual Jedi Knight, but also follow Qui-Gon's orders to the letter. The Council had tried to send multiple different Knights and Masters on missions with them over the years, and Qui-Gon treated them all the exact same way. Fimor and anyone they were working with were expected to keep up with Qui-Gon's actions, cover for his blunders and accidental acquisitions, 90% of the time attributed to the will of the Force, and let Qui-Gon make all the final decisions. Fimor was pretty sure he could count on one hand the number of Jedi who were actually willing to go on missions with Qui-Gon at this point. And sadly, this was all before Xanatos. Sometimes Fimor thought that the only reason he had gotten through a Padawanship with Qui-Gon was because he was a practical person who knew to ask for help. After the initial terror of their first few missions when he was 13, Fimor had signed up for every single class he thought might be relevant, and many that weren't, just to get access to other masters and their teachings. Qui-Gon still handled teaching him lightsaber techniques, but Fimor could tell the man was grateful that Fimor had farmed out everything else. Not that Qui-Gon couldn't be an affectionate and friendly master when he felt like it, but he certainly didn't want a Padawan taking up all his time. Or perhaps he just didn't want Fimor doing so, since he'd apparently smothered Xanatos in a dungeon. Fimor was still working through his bitterness about that even now. Lately, he realized the entire cantina had gone quiet, and Areta Crez was staring at him with startling intensity.
"You were that Shaburjan's ad?" she asked.
"His first student, yes."
"The one he rejected because he did a poor job with his Dini Xanatos."
The Mandalorians were terrifyingly well informed.
"Yes." "Right," said Chris. "The Mandalore's definitely going to want to meet you."
"I'd really rather just leave," said Fimor.
There were actual waves of sympathy he could sense in the Force from the hardened warriors who surrounded him. It was very disconcerting.
"I was supposed to bring you to meet him anyway after vetting you," she explained. "There's not a lot of data about you out there on the HoloNet, and I can't give you the more secure intel until I do."
Fimor sighed. That made perfect sense, but he didn't have to like it.
"Fine."
He proceeded to shut down his pad.
"What's a Dini, anyway?"
he asked as they headed for the door.
"Lunatic."
"Ah!" said Fimor. That made perfect sense from what he'd read about Xanatos' plans on Vandermeer. He returned the friendly wave goodbye he was given by one of the Mandalorians near the door. He didn't bother to pull his hood up again when they stepped outside. Areta led him to a large walled compound which had 2 Mandalorians in full armor standing guard outside of the open gates. They were both scanned before they could go in, even though Areta had to have been in and out of here thousands of times, and their scanner didn't seem to even detect his lightsaber. He must have looked puzzled. "Everyone going in gets scanned. Death Watch likes to plant bombs on unsuspecting targets," said one of the guards helpfully. They pulled off their helmet after the scan, revealing they were Pantoran with dark blue skin and yellow eyes. "I'm Darna, by the way. Nice to meet you."
Their partner elbowed them in the side.
"Get your bullshit back on, you Dinku! We're on 30! "Nice to meet you as well,"
said Fimor with a bright bow, then hurried after Areta Crez. Much to his dismay, she led him right through a whole courtyard, which had a number of Mandalorians doing target practice and fighting. Fimor kept his eyes on the opposite side of the courtyard and ignored the pressure of their stairs and the shot of blaster fire followed by a yelp. They passed another guard who waved them through and up a set of stairs. Areta punched in a code and plugged in a lock cylinder before the door at the top slid open.
"Mandalore?"
Areta was addressing a man in silver armor with a yellow diamond across the chest plate and a red cape.
"Jedi Knight Fimor is here."
The Mandalore motioned them inside. Areta turned to him.
"Fimor, this is the Mandalore, Jaster Mariel. I'll leave you with them and be back in an hour."
She turned to go, then turned back, the grin evident on her face.
"Fimor is the former Padawan of Jin, Alor."
She headed back down the stairs, giving Fimor a friendly slap to the arm on her way out. Mariel's eyes widened, and he studied Fimor more closely. Fimor got the strangest impression he was being checked over for injuries.
"I haven't actually seen Qui-Gon in a few years,"
he said, trying to head off more sympathy. Not since that last joint sparring session. Qui-Gon had been in a very good mood then, talking about how Fimor's saber work made him proud.
Femur would always wonder if the pride had been in him, or if it had actually been about being able to throw a successful knight in the faces of those who were questioning how well Qui-Gon was teaching Xanatos. He suspected the latter, while his heart hoped it was the former. Garkeep is going to have to schedule a meeting with his mind healer after this. You know, here on Mandalore, children can actually disown their parents, said Muriel.
I appreciate the cultural knowledge, Mandalore,
said Femur, willing the man to drop the topic. Fortunately, he seemed to get the hint. He gestured to a set of chairs around a small table in one corner of the office. Come sit down and call me Jaster. You Jedi are big on titles, aren't you?
You're saying your people call you Jaster?
Asked Femur, a bit skeptically. Jaster laughed. When we're not in battle, I'm lucky if they use my name instead of bastard and asshole. He picked up a tall carafe on the table. You ever try shake?
No, sir.
He took a sip of the steaming golden beverage once it was poured into a clear cup, braced not to show any emotion no matter what it tasted like. He needn't have bothered. It tasted of warm, slightly bitter citrus.
It's lovely.
Jaster pushed what looked like some red honey his way, but he didn't need it. Now, Arta tells me you're on a mission to find the author of the Mandalorian's dilemma, and you'd like to share data.
Yes, sir.
What are you going to do when you find them?
Protect them from anyone who wants to hurt them due to the book.
After having spent the last few days reading up on Mandalorian politics, there was absolutely no doubt in Femur's mind that Death Watch was trying to hunt down Morad Damor to kill them. It also wouldn't surprise him if the new Mandalorians were doing the same, though probably to sue the author or some other non-violent thing. And if they're a Jedi.
What do you mean?
Would they be punished for writing it? Asked Jaster. Oh, that's what he meant.
There's no rule against writing books in the Jedi Order. They might get a scolding, at worst.
Oh, really? Considering how the book was causing profound changes across the galaxy, writing it seemed to definitely fall under the will of the Force. Someone in the council must agree, considering the book was
accidentally sent to the entire Jedi Order yesterday. The writer also isn't any of the Jedi at the temple.
Really? Femur nodded.
I had Master Vesta, who is in charge of temple communications, look at the archived outgoing transmissions from the temple for the past 2 years for the text of the novel and communications with the Mandalorian sector. There was nothing other than a incursion by a slicer who could be traced back to Concord Dawn, but that was after the novel was published.
Jaster grimaced. I know someone got a hold of a bunch of your personnel files a couple of months back. Revenge was not the Jedi way, but that slicer better watch our back. Femur had gotten the impression from Vesta that he had written a special program with that slicer's name on it. Also, Femur's file must not have been included, considering Erta had to search his name and vet him. So what's your theory, then? Asked Jaster. Femur was unsure if he should tell him. He hadn't been ordered to keep his mission in any way secret, nor did the two Mandalorians seem to be hunting down the author to do anything other than appreciate their work. But he also wasn't sure about the security of their conversation right now. The Mandalore was a perceptive man. Just as he had noticed Femur didn't want to talk about Qui-Gon anymore, he also realized the source of Femur's hesitation. This room is scanned twice daily for listening devices and has jammers built in the walls, in case you are wondering. But let me tell you my theory first. I think it's an older Mandalorian who knows their history and has spent time working with a Jedi on the Outer Rim or the Unknown Regions. There's a bunch of us history fanatics who are debating the book, but I've lost touch with some of the Mandalorians I consulted with while writing the Super Commando Codex.
That agrees with my theory, admitted Femur. I think it's probably a member of Explore Corps who ran into a Mandalorian in the Unknown Regions, but it could easily be the Mandalorian they ran into instead.
Explore Corps.
There are 4 Jedi Service Corps, which are made up of Jedi who didn't become knights for whatever reason, and Jedi Knights and Masters who feel called to do research or service. Med Corps, Agri Corps, Explore Corps, and Edu Corps. Explore Corps have ships where they do scientific research, but they're most well known for sending out lone Jedi to map and explore the unknown regions and archaeological sites. They spend a lot of time traveling alone, and don't have to report directly back to the temple, so I think they'd have plenty of time to write and encounter Mandalorians.
Since they were so far from temple authority, they also were more likely to have relaxed views on attachment. Femur was not sure if it was true, but there were temple rumors that some of them were married or had families. Jaster looked stunned. So you're saying there are 4 other groups of Jedi out there that my people didn't know about?
Fimor winced, and he just opened up the court of Mandalorian-style courting. He said the mental apology winging their way. None of them are very large groups, and some don't even carry lightsabers, he warned.
Jaster snorted. That's not going to stop the Mandalore, but I like your theory, he said. I think you have a good chance of finding Mora Damor. I'll instruct Erta to share her intel with you. I can't send Chris with you since she's essential personnel, but there are plenty of Verde who I can spare.
Damn it. How to politely decline? This is a solo mission, sir.
If you think I'm sending you off without some backup against Death Watch, you're insane.
I'm trying to be low-key and stealthy, sir. A Mandalorian in full armor is not stealthy.
I'll let whoever I send with you know they'll need to spend some time out of armor,
countered Jaster.
His face took on a sardonic look. And it's a moot point anyway. Those Dikude are already fighting over who gets to go with you.
He motioned over Fimor's shoulder to the window.
Fimor turned to look. There was a crowd of Mandalorians in the dirt-covered courtyard centered on 2 Mandalorians who were fighting hand-to-hand.
They haven't even seen me fight, muttered Fimor.
That's why he'd been very careful to see Monasumi here on Mandalore.
Jaster laughed.
You're a Jedi Knight. They know you can fight. You're handsome to boot, and no doubt they've already heard about Jin.
Fimor grimaced at that.
Jaster clapped a hand on his shoulder. Don't worry. I won't approve whoever wins if I think they aren't right for you or the mission. Now go see your Babur, he ordered. It'll do you good. I'll let Arta know and tell whatever Verde wins the battle to track you down there.
My Babur, wondered Fimor, feeling distinctly like he'd been outmaneuvered.
Your grandfather, though I guess your Jedi would say Grandmaster Yonduku.
Master Dooku is here.
It hadn't occurred to him that his Grandmaster would have accompanied the Mandalorians back from Galadron. Also, he'd never met the man. Both Dooku and Qui-Gon shared a proclivity for being out of the temple the majority of the time, though from what Fimor had heard, it may have been deliberate on one or both their parts that Fimor had never met Dooku. Yes, him and a bunch of other Jedi are staying in one of the family suites. Jaster's comm pinged and he walked over to look at his pad. And it seems there's a Master Fey here to see me. If I don't see you before you leave, good luck on your mission, Fimor.